So we'll get started with something pretty easy, and that's just listing out the polls that are currently available. Remember, they have to be between the start and the end date for these to be able to be displayed. So we'll include that in the query. So we first of all need a connection to our database. So inside of the main directory, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this app. And inside of this, I'm going to create a new file, and this is going to be called init.php or initialization.php. And what this is going to do is it's just a basic way when you're playing around or creating a very small application to store all of the useful things that need to be reused between different pages. If you think about it, in index, poll, and vote.php, we need a database connection. So we're going to store all of that here. Now we also need to start sessions. So we're going to say session start, and I'm going to set the session user ID key to 1. Remember earlier we basically explained that was just the user that's currently logged in. So we now have a session with user ID of 1. We'll ignore that for now though because we're not dealing with that in this part. Let's now create a database connection. So we're going to be using PDO. So we're going to create a new PDO instance here, and we're going to be using the MySQL driver. And we need to define the host, which is going to be localhost or 127.0.0.1. We also need to define the DB name, and if we check out SQL Pro, you can see that this is just website. So in here, we'll just say website. Now we need to provide our login credentials. In this case, mine's just root and root, and that's it. We're done. We now have a connection to our database, and we can use this DB variable in any page that we include init.php. So in that case, then let's go ahead and do that up here. So we'll start and end a PHP tag, and we're going to require once, or you can just do a require app/init.php. So that's including app init, and now down here we can make use of that DB variable. So we're going to do that now. Obviously, we're going to query the database, and we want to select the ID of the poll, the question from that polls table. So I'm going to create a variable called polls query. I'm going to use this as we go along. It's going to be something query. That's going to equal, we're going to assign the result from DB query. So in double quotes, I'm going to pull this down, and we're going to select, and we need to choose now which fields we want. The only fields we want is ID and question, and that's from the polls table. So we're selecting the ID and the question from this table, and that's going to select all records because we're not adding a limit on it. But what we want to do now is we want to say where the current date is between the start and end date. So we say where date now, so we use the now function, between starts and ends. Simple as that. So we now should have our two polls, and we'll change the date over just to make sure that that's working. But we need to actually loop through and add these objects into an array. So I'm going to create an array called polls, and that's going to allow me to just easily output that everything down here. So we do a little while loop here, and we're going to say while we're going to assign something to a variable called row, and that's going to be polls query, and we're going to use the fetch object method. So the fetch object method will basically give us back an object for each record in the database. So what we can actually do to just test this is do a print r on row. Let's check this out. There we go. So we've got a std class object here as well as here. So these are two separate objects. I'll just highlight this one to make it a little bit easier. And you can see there we've got the ID and we've got the question. So I'm going to add these to an array. I'm going to assign these within this loop to an array called polls, and we do that using the bracket notation here, and we assign row to it. So what we've now got is, if we just do an echo and we wrap this in pre-tags, and this will just preserve the formatting, we can actually do a print r in between this on polls, and that's going to give us out the following. So that makes it a little bit easier to see what you're working with. You know that you've got an ID property and a question property, so we can loop through and output these. So we'll get rid of that because we don't need it. But down here, we're going to do our outputting. So obviously what we need to do is check that there are polls actually available. So let's just get rid of this markup because it's fairly easily rewritten. I'm going to use very basic PHP templating here to say if not empty, and we're going to access that polls array. And down here, we're going to say else. And then down here, we're going to end that if, like so. So if the polls array isn't empty, that means there are polls available. Otherwise, there are no polls available. So I'm going to just output a paragraph here, and I'm going to say, sorry, no polls available right now. And that's it. Here, this will be, there are polls available. So we create our unordered list, and we need to loop through each of these polls otherwise. So we're going to say, for each, and here we'll say polls as poll. Down here we'll end our for each, like so. And in here, you've probably already guessed, we need to output our list item for each one. And in here, we're going to have an anchor. So we'll start with the actual label of the anchor. In this case, it's just echo, and we're going to echo out poll. And because each of these are an object, we use this, and we say poll name, or is it poll question? Yeah, poll question, like so. So let's check this out. Let's go refresh. There we go. So we've basically got our two polls now output to the page. Let's change the end date to maybe the 8th month. And this is obviously going to mean that because we're now past this, it probably won't, oh no, it will show them, of course, because we're on this day. Let's just change that to, I don't know, the 26th. So let's say it ended yesterday. There we go. Sorry, no polls available now. So that's basically how that's going to work. Let's again just change these back to 9 or 10. There we go. So we've got these two polls now. We know that the message will come up if there aren't any polls, but we now need to know where we're going to link through to. Well, we know we're going through to poll.php, but we need some way to identify which poll that we're looking at. In this case, I'm going to say ID equals, then we're going to output the ID of the poll. Now, just beware that if these polls are, you don't want people to access them unless they have the link, this isn't a very good solution. The reason being is we're using incremental IDs here. So, for example, if there's a poll with an ID of 1, someone's likely going to guess that there's an ID of a poll with an ID of 2, 3, 4, 5. So if this isn't what you want, you might want to replace this with some kind of hash. You still want an index there on the ID column in your database, but you might just have some kind of hash that's maybe an MD5 generated hash or something. But for now, we'll leave this as it is. So in here, we're going to open and close the PHP tag, and we're going to echo, you've probably already guessed, poll ID. So that's going to echo out the ID from that. So now, when we click through, you can see that this goes through to poll.php with an ID of 1, and this second one goes to poll.php with an ID of 2. Excellent. So we've now got a list of the currently available polls between the start date and the end date. So just making sure that they can be shown. And we've now output our listing. So that's it. We've listed our polls and we can click through. And in the next part, we'll actually be creating the ability to answer the poll.